This video is all about the brakes on the Mercedes R107. This particular car is a 1975 280 SL, a left-hand drive. We are going to be talking about the various brake master cylinders that came with these cars over the years. We're going to be touching on the reservoir tanks here, taking a closer look at this car and pointing out everything that's wrong and that is missing with this car, attempting to fix that, and if we have time, making up a new brake line, putting in the correct rubber gaskets and getting us one step further to getting this car moving. The brake master cylinder is just held to the brake booster with two nuts and a couple of spring washers. Before you can remove the brake master cylinder, you're going to have to undo the brake lines, and on a Mercedes you're going to have to get an 11mm brake line spanner. If you try and undo those brake line fittings with a normal spanner, there is a good chance that you will round them. So get yourself a brake line spanner. As I say, for a Mercedes it is 11mm. The brake line fittings themselves have an M10 times 1mm thread. It is easier to remove the brake master cylinder and the brake fluid reservoir in one go. These brake reservoirs can be in there pretty tight, and you must not be tempted to start wiggling them back and forwards, otherwise you may end up snapping off the brake fluid reservoir in the master cylinder, and that is an expensive mistake. Genuine reservoirs cost almost £400, although you can get a reproduction reservoir, and I'll leave the part number on the screen. Once you've got the whole unit off the car, you will see that there are just two rubber grommets here in the brake master cylinder, and the brake fluid reservoir simply pushes into there. But as I say, they can be in there really tight, and sometimes getting a set of needle nose pliers and wedging upwards will get one of them out, and then you can twist back and forwards to get the other one out. But do not be tempted to rock this from side to side like that, otherwise you do run the risk of damaging it. A little tip: if you want to avoid getting brake fluid everywhere when you take one of these off, you can take this cap here off. This is actually a vented cap, it's got a small hole in it. Take the cap off, put a piece of cling film over there, and then put the cap back on, so you're creating a vacuum. And then when you take the brake master cylinder off the car, you'll find that you don't get a whole load of brake fluid coming out of the ports. When you buy a new brake master cylinder, it should always come with a rubber gasket, and that seals the brake master cylinder to the brake booster so that you don't get any vacuum leaks there. The job of the brake booster here is simply to make it easier to push the brake pedal down when you're driving. So when you've got the engine running, there's a vacuum created inside here, making it easier to push the brake pedal down, and the springs inside the master cylinder will help that brake pedal retract when you take your foot off the brake. It is a good idea when you're working with brake fluid to have gloves on and goggles as well, because you do not want to get brake fluid either in your eyes, preferably on your hands, and definitely not on the paintwork of your car, because it will corrode the paint. Just before we go on and start talking about the brake master cylinder and how that works and the difference between them, I just want to touch on the differences between the brake reservoirs. These brake reservoirs here all have three chambers. One chamber for the front brakes, one chamber for the back brakes, and one chamber for the clutch. Now, if your car is an automatic, what you will find is that this outlet port here has a plastic cap over it like that, that's glued on. These electrical connectors here are wired together, so that if either the brake fluid in the front brake reservoir or the rear brake reservoir runs low, the brake light on your dash, the red brake light, will come on. On later Mercedes, you may find a black button on here which you can press that actually tests those brake light low fluid warning lights on your dash. If you want to test whether these are working on the older style of reservoir, just take one of these caps off, and there is a plunger in here that would normally be floating high like that when there's fluid in the reservoir, and as the level drops it gets closer towards those connections, and when it hits those connections there, the red light on your dash comes on when the ignition light or the engine is running. If you want to test that, you can manually push that down with your finger with the ignition on or the engine running, and you should see that red brake light come on. The cap on the reservoir is actually vented, and if you shake it, you should be able to hear it rattling. There's a tiny little pinhole in here, and that basically allows the level of the brake fluid to fall as your brake pads wear down without creating a vacuum inside here. So basically you will allow air out, but you won't allow air in. On some of the older cars you may have this black gasket, rubber gasket in there, so that when you're topping up the reservoir the fluid flows equally to both chambers. Now, some people are not aware that the chambers in these reservoirs are actually separated. And if you're simply looking at the minimum and max level on the side here and you're trying to bleed your brakes, you might not realize that to bleed your rear brakes, this reservoir actually needs to be at least 95% full, so that the fluid that you're pouring in the main reservoir flows over a little plastic divider in there into the rear brake reservoir. Otherwise you will be pumping your brakes forever, possibly completely ruining your master cylinder and wondering why you're just getting air in those rear brakes. So just remember, the brake chambers in here, the front chamber is bigger than the rear chamber, and the rear chamber, in order to fill it with fluid, this needs to be at least 95% full. So just bear that in mind when you're bleeding the brakes and topping this up. The brake master cylinders are specific to your model of car, and they're not generally interchangeable. For example, this brake master cylinder here is off our 1974 450 SL right-hand drive car, and you can see that the outlet ports are on this side. This master cylinder here is on our 1975 280 SL, which is a left-hand drive car, and although the cylinders are almost identical, you can see that the outlet ports are on this side of the car for a left-hand drive car. So that's the first thing. Left-hand drive and right-hand drive cars have different master cylinders. On later SLs, the output ports, or the position of the output ports, changed here. On the earlier cars, you can see that the outlet ports are both here at the end, whereas on this one here you've got one outlet port here and one outlet port there, and that is the brake master cylinder that you would have on that 1976 280 SL left-hand drive up there. Now the good news is, on later cars the brake master cylinders are readily available. For example, the correct brake master cylinder for our 1976 280 SL is Phoebe part number 12275, but you need to be careful because brake master cylinders can look very, very similar but actually have subtle differences both inside the bore and also the end fittings. So for example, here you can see that these two brake master cylinders, although they look identical, have very slight differences here, and this will not fit on the 280 SL despite the fact it looks identical, and indeed it has a different part number, 12270, different Phoebe part number. In conclusion, just because a brake master cylinder looks identical, there may be subtle differences that you can't first see, so you must cross-reference the part with Mercedes if you're changing your brake master cylinder. In many cases, there are rebuild kits for brake master cylinders, but to get the brake master cylinder apart can be a bit of an effort. If you look at these three brake master cylinders, all of which would fit the 280 SL that we're doing, you can see that here and here you have a nut or a locking pin which you need to take out in order to be able to take the cylinder out, whereas on this unit here there is no locking pin. If you were rebuilding the brake master cylinder on a W123 Mercedes, you would have to take out the first piston and spring and then locate the locking pin, take the locking pin out, which is very difficult to see because it's located in one of these channels here, in order to be able to remove the second piston and spring. On later SLs from about 1962-63 onwards, these brake master cylinders are all referred to as dual or tandem brake master cylinders, and that is because they have dual circuits inside here and dual reservoirs. On earlier cars you just had one brake fluid reservoir serving both front and rear brakes, so if you had a leak you would lose both front and rear brakes at the same time, and similarly if one of your springs broke or one of your seals broke in here you would lose all braking simultaneously, whereas on later cars they have independent brake circuits. You can have a leak in one cylinder and still have some braking potential. brake master cylinders will generally suffer from one of three problems. If you're lucky, the problem will simply be that these top grommets here have become hard and the reservoir is leaking around here. You can just replace the grommets without having to take the whole system to pieces. Sometimes the seal at the end here starts to leak, and you might not know or see any drips under the car. All you may notice is that the brake fluid reservoir level is dropping. Now, when I was researching this video, this is our 1965 Pagoda here, I noticed that the level in our reservoir here is very low. That's the level there, and the maximum is up here. And the reason for that low level, I suspect, is if we put our hand down here, you can actually see a little bit of dampness. So I suspect that our brake master cylinder here on this 1965 Pagoda is leaking out of that end seal. Now, if your brake master cylinder is leaking brake fluid into the brake booster, as I say, you won't necessarily see any drips under the car, but what will eventually happen is you will corrode the brake booster here, and this is an extremely expensive part of the car. You can easily pay £1,000 or more for one of these. So it is an idea just to check whether or not, when you take your brake master cylinder off, is there any dampness around there? Because if there is, it's an idea to get that addressed as soon as possible to avoid thousands of pounds on a new brake booster, if indeed it's still available. If one of these seals inside the brake master cylinder is leaking, you may not be able to build up any brake pressure in that circuit. So you may find that your brake pedal is going to the floor when you're braking. Whilst it's always cheaper to rebuild the brake master cylinder if the kit is available, you might find that it's not always a simple matter to get the brake cylinder apart. In theory, to take a brake master cylinder to pieces, all you need to do is take off the circlip with a set of circlip pliers or needle nose pliers. Then there will be a little plate like this with a hole in it. Make sure you get the orientation right when you take it out. Then there will be a rubber cup seal like that, and that is where it starts getting interesting, because this white seal in here, if your brake master cylinder has been sitting around and not used for or taken to pieces for many years, you will find it's almost impossible to get that out. You might also find that the seats upon which the brake line fittings sit have become corroded, as they have on this particular car, so we won't be attempting to rebuild this cylinder here. Unfortunately, the brake master cylinder on our car is one of the ones that's difficult to get hold of, but we managed to get one from Belgium from a company called autocity.eu. The Phoebe ones down there for the later cars generally tend to be sub £100. If you do go down the rebuild route, it's essential that you very carefully lay out the parts and the exact orientation that they came out. For example, inside here are cup seals, and those seals are specifically designed to flare out when you depress the brake pedal one way, so that allows you to build pressure. But when you release the brake pedal, the sides of the cup seal fold in and allow brake fluid to come back into the brake cylinder to replenish the brake fluid. So if you get one of those cup seals the wrong way around, your brake cylinder will not work. When you take one of these to pieces, you will notice that the two springs are either of different length or different tension. The spring closest to the C-clip here will tend to be more compressed than the back spring, and that is because in order to get the thing back together, you have to push this in to compress it, and when this is pushed in, both springs then have exactly the same tension and are the same length. On some cars, the springs themselves, they may be the same length, but they have different tension in them. And when you are reassembling your brake master cylinder, always make sure you lubricate the rubber cup seals with brake fluid prior to reassembly. If you do need to rebuild or replace your brake master cylinder, you will find it is a million times easier to bench bleed the master cylinder rather than trying to do it once it's on the car. Now, there are a few good videos about bench bleeding brake master cylinders, so I'm not going to go into that in this video, but suffice to say, to get the air out of a cylinder, sometimes you've got to tilt it up and down, and you can try parking your car on an incline, etc., but it's much easier to do that on a bench. And as I say, once you have bled it, don't forget the trick of putting a bit of cling film over the reservoir cap, so that when you put it back on the car, you're not simply dribbling out fluid again. The brake master cylinder has a number of different functions, the first of which is to build pressure in the brake lines. The amount of pressure that's built in the brake lines will be dependent on the bore size. This is a 23mm bore brake cylinder here. You can see it stamped on the side there, and also on the rod that pushes this in, i.e. the brake travel. So when you press the brake pedal, there is a short time before it actually engages the brake master cylinder and is pushing in, and that is known as the dead stroke. And if you put a different brake pedal on your car or have a different rod there, you are potentially changing the hydraulic pressure in the whole system. Similarly, on our SL55, which has AMG brakes on the front of it with multiple pistons in the calipers, you can't simply take the brake master cylinder off an SL500 and hope that it'll do the same job. If you are changing the type of calipers on a car, you also need to make sure that you change the brake master cylinder to be matched to those calipers. And similarly, if you're changing the brake pedal for whatever reason, you need to make sure that the stroke of the brake pedal is still giving you sufficient pressure to stop the car. The pressure in a brake pedal can be hundreds of psi, and if you're really jamming your foot on the brake in an emergency, it can be up to 1000 psi. Now, the smaller the bore size, the higher the pressure. But as I mentioned, brake cylinders are not generally interchangeable. The way in which the brake master cylinder builds pressure is actually very clever. If you look down here, you will see that there are two holes, a front hole which is smaller, and in fact at the bottom of that hole there's just a tiny little outlet, less than a millimeter, and then a rear hole that's larger. The front hole is called the compensating port, and the rear hole is called the replenishing port or breather port. Now that front hole there is uncovered when you're not pressing the brake pedal, i.e. that hole is directly connected to the brake fluid reservoir via a tiny hole, and what that does is allows constant brake fluid pressure and volume in the system. When the brake pads start to wear down, you're going to need to add brake fluid to the system to compensate for that, and that is what that little hole compensates for. And similarly, when the brakes are in use, the brake fluid will get hot, and liquids generally expand when they get hot. So therefore, you're going to need less fluid in the brake circuit, and that compensates, that front hole there compensates for less fluid. So when your foot is not on the brake, the piston is halfway between those two holes. As soon as you push your foot on the brake, that hole is covered, causing a closed circuit in here. The brake fluid is compressed. Pascal's law will say that any force you apply here will be applied at the end of the fluid, and your brake pistons on the calipers are then pushed in. When you take your foot off the pedal, these springs spring back, and that releases the pistons from your calipers. The rear hole, the larger hole here, is known as the inlet or the breather or the replenishing hole. This is the hole here that allows you to replenish brake fluid as you start to run low, as your brake pads wear out. It is also the hole that allows brake fluid to get into the master cylinder as you release your foot off the brakes. As I mentioned, the rubber cups in here flare out when you push your foot on the brake and cause an airtight seal, and when they come back, those seals fold in and allow brake fluid to flow over there to replenish the brake fluid. That process of allowing brake fluid to re-enter the master cylinder avoids a build-up of low pressure in front of the piston, which could suck air past the caliper pistons down on the brake caliper. And finally, if for any reason you have air in the master cylinder here, that breather hole there would allow that air to escape out of the reservoir on top of the brake master cylinder. If the tiny little compensation port there gets clogged for any reason, that could cause excessive drag on your brakes, causing your brakes to heat up or your pads to wear out quicker than they otherwise should. The other thing that could cause excessive drags is if you haven't set your brake pedal up correctly, and that is actually pushed in constantly, because it only has to travel a very short distance before that little compensating hole is closed and you are building pressure in the system, which is pushing the brake caliper pistons in. I was hoping in this video to actually have time to make up brake pipes, fill the system with brake fluid and start doing some tests, but it's not going to be that simple. As is so often the case, these brake line fittings are rusted solid and are not coming out. So the only way to have got that out is to cut it. What we're going to have to do is order new brake lines. They're not particularly expensive, only about £10, but in order to get that brake line out, I've had to bend that back and forwards until it snaps, and I don't want to be using rusty brake springs like that, so we've ordered some of those from Euro Car Parts. So I think what I'll do in the next video is just put new brake lines on, make up new brake pipes, splice on the electrical connectors which we've taken here from our parts car, and see if we can get the brakes working on this car.